to the James Merrill House 25 years ago, shortly after James Merrill's death in 1995. Since then, over 80 writers have visited, staying in his home, a National Historic Landmark, to work on projects of their own. Thanks to Merrill's generosity, the house now belongs to the Stonington Village Improvement Association and is an ongoing inspiration for writers and poets from around the world. For more information, visit our website, jamesmerrillhouse.org. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joanna Scott, a member of the James Merrill House Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome our audiences near and far, those who are watching now and those who tune into this, our virtual archive at a future time. A special welcome to our featured guest, Pemi Aguda, our current writer in residence at the James Merrill House, and fellow author Gerardo Sámano Córdova. Pemi Aguda comes to us from Lagos, Nigeria. She has 2 books currently slated for publication, a book of short stories titled Ghost Roots and a novel, The Suicide Mothers. Her stories have appeared in a wide array of publications, including Granta, Zoetrope, All Story Plowshares, and One Story. She is not afraid to take on big themes in her fiction, the suffering of women and children during environmental turmoil, questions of the individual versus community, fate, friendship, cosmic justice. She has an extraordinary ability to provide a vivid immersion in reality and at the same time infuse reality with dream and imaginative possibility. Both her books are forthcoming from W.W. Norton. She has an MFA from the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan. Her writing has won prestigious awards, including a 2022 O. Henry Prize and the Deborah Rogers Foundation Writers Award. She was a 2020 Aspen Words Emerging Writing Fellow, a 2021 Fiction Fellow with the Miami Book Fair, and a 2022 McDowell Fellow. Pemi will be in conversation with Gerardo Sámano Córdova. Gerardo is a writer and artist from Mexico City and holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Michigan. He has studied at Breadloaf as a work study scholar and at Tin House. His work has appeared in Catapult, The Common, Ninth Letter, Passages North, and the Chicago Quarterly Review. And Gerardo has a first novel just out, Monstrilio. In the novel, he imagines a boy who transforms into a monster who tries to be a man, and the people who love him in every form he takes. The writer Alexander Chee describes the book as an extraordinary act of imagination, an extended meditation that begins in grief, family belonging, and moves past that into a deeper discovery of the power of love and the powerlessness of love, as well as its strangeness. With Monstrilio, Sámano Córdova makes a remarkable kaleidoscopic debut. Monstrilio has been listed already as one of 2023's most anticipated books by several literary sites, including The Millions, LitHub, and Elle, and it has just been published. So many congratulations to you, Gerardo, with the publication of your first novel, and to you, Pemi, on your 2 forthcoming books. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Hello.
Hi.
So I wanted to start by reading just a little bit of an introduction I did for Pemi a little bit ago that I think applies to this moment. Some days Pemi likes to draw ghosts, tiny oval-headed creatures with large eyes and undulating bottoms. Some of them wear sunglasses, others have plump lips, lustrous eyelashes, and carry a camera. My favorite, and one I treasure on my bookcase, is an unadored ghost on a boat. I don't know where he's going, but he looks at me through the holes of the sheet he wears. To be seen, these ghosts must drape sheets over themselves. Otherwise, how will we know they exist? They want us to know they exist. Pemi's writing does just that. Her stories throw sheets over that which we choose not to see. Her protagonists encounter worlds where that which they keep hidden becomes tangible. Uh, I wanted to read this because I love the idea of ghosts, and I know your forthcoming collection has the word ghosts in it. And I think we share a passion for that space of ghostliness in a way,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
um, like in the intersection between what is real and what isn't.
Mm-hmm.
That that can be horrific, but also emotional and like a way to embody things that we may not be able to see,
Yes.
right?
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think that so Gerardo and I met at the MFA program at the University of Michigan, and we quickly bonded over many things. A couple of which were both like non-American. We have
Yeah.
some experiences that made us bond over that, but also, as you said, our love for like speculative fiction, like the unreal in quotes, like magical realism and like horror adjacent techniques. So yeah, that's something we definitely. I just love hauntings. I love ghosts. I love anything that can be read in different ways. But also, it's something I love in your work. I think that whenever I read you, I'm such a big fan, but whenever I read you, I think that there's this real like joy and magic that comes through, even when you take us to some relatively dark places. I think that there is a way the reader can tell that you love your characters, and that's very inspiring to me.
Well, I mean, I read your work and I'm in awe and inspired. And I think it's funny because you can say we work in the same in a same plane of thinking, but at the same time, our work can be very different. The
Hmm.
way we approach this idea of horror or fantasy or so it's very interesting to me how using those techniques, forms, or tropes, whatever you want to call them, we can come up with very different
Different.
ways of writing.
Yeah,
And that's very interesting. It's also very nice to see that there's a breadth of work in this field
in the
that
field.
can
Yeah.
that can be, that shows how much it can give and how much you can do with it.
Hmm.
And there's
Yeah.
also playfulness.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense since we come from such like very with our life different experiences are different. We come from very different places, even though it has its similarities. So I think when we all bring such drastic differences, even to the same place, just based off of our different experiences, like something new would come out of it.
Yes,
Um, yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Should I read now? Maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read a short story called Contributions. It was originally published in American short fiction, but it will be included in my short story collection called Ghost Roots that is coming out with Norton next year. There isn't much you need to know about the story. It's about 6 minutes long, except it's about a money cooperative by women. So here's contributions. We have been practicing Isusu for a long time. Our mothers did it. Our mothers' mothers did it. And probably their own mothers too. We've never had a problem of this kind before. Nothing so significant before this woman showed up. Nothing we couldn't fix anyway. This is how our system works. Each woman has 1 month to contribute a certain amount of naira. Our names are in a list, and when that month is over, whoever's number one takes it all. Then the contributions begin again, and at the end of the second month, number two collects. The names are always in random order. We go down the list until the last person has collected, then reset. This works for us. We don't need your banks, we don't need your loans, we can take care of ourselves. Things aren't always smooth. There was a time Iya Ibeji wasted her collection on a trip to Dubai, camel rides, and shopping, and then couldn't make her contribution the next month. We had to seize her frozen food storage generator until she came up with the money. We are not wicked people, you must understand, but for this system to work, there has to be order. Another time, Mrs. B had to pay hospital bills for her son's operation. If we show pity even once, our structure will collapse on itself. So we seized Mrs. B's daughter. The daughter made meals for us. She carried our bags when we went to the market, relieving us of some burdens. She rubbed our feet and plaited our hair. When Mrs. B raised the money, we sent her daughter back home. We still have fond memories of the girl, her sweet face, her spicy beef stew, the way she sprang lightly from foot to foot as if her bones were made of paper. Ours is a small group. We must be for trust, for reliability. Not just anyone will accept our terms of admittance, both lifelong and strict. We take what we can until your obligations are met, and for many, this is too much power, too much risk. We haven't invited you here, we tell the ones who balk at our terms. Their heads tilted at beseeching angles. Go try your luck at the banks. We've worked too hard to allow any stupid leniency that could risk sending us back to the gutters. So when the new woman came sniffing at our meetings with her long nose, we warned her, asked if she was certain. Yes, she said. She needed an alternative to the banks. Yes, she said she was sure. She was a cousin to one of our brother's best friends, so we said okay, even if we were hesitant, our hands fiddling with wrappers, our chests tight, so we welcomed her. At first, things went smoothly. Nonsense hardly ever shows itself immediately. She paid her contributions on time. She came to the meetings and drank Fanta and ate chin chin with us. She weighed in on decisions like what color to wear to Sisi Oge's daughter's wedding. But by the fourth month, she started leaving texts on our phones, begging for more time. Look, it doesn't work this way. We appraised her life, checking for what we could seize, what we could take from her so she would understand the gravity of this commitment. We found nothing except a husband and an old mother in the village. We seized the husband. Alas, he was useless in our homes. He sat with our husbands, his big beer belly and their big beer bellies all shuddering gelatinously in mirth at some distasteful joke. Her husband screamed at football games with ours, played table tennis in our gardens, whooping like a fool whenever the ball thwacked against the paddle in his hand. Sometimes he looked at us. He looked at us and reminded us of the expanse of our hips, the heft of our breasts, reminded us of the ways our bodies take up space. We returned the husband, and still she couldn't pay her contribution, so we seized her mother. Her mother was no better. The old woman sat brooding in corners, her eyes bulging out at us as we picked beans or sewed a button on. She blended in with the cobwebs, her skin acquiring a dark fuzz, a gleaming scaliness, exploiting shifting shadows. And when she eventually turned into a frog, and then a lizard, and then a cat, our children squealed in delight. But when they tried to pet the cats, she scratched their hands, drawing blood, leaving scars in the shapes of the strange language. She leaped away from our punishing arms to perch high above our heads, and we craned our necks to look at her, envying the fluffy agility, the way she could wrangle her body into a smaller, lighter version of itself, stealthy and wily and out of reach. We sent the mother away and called the woman in. What else could she give us to hold on to until she could make her contribution? We sat her in the center of the group so she could feel our glares prick at her skin from every direction, feel the pressure of our disappointment. Look, she said, will you take my arms? Her arms were long and muscular and had known work. We accepted them. They were useful in our kitchens, these arms, chopping leaves here, stirring in pots there, pounding yams, slicing apples. They were useful in the household, sweeping dust down the corridor and rocking the child to sleep. Sometimes the arms wrapped around us when our husbands were yelling, or when the children were crying again, or when the sky looked the wrong shade of blue. But still she couldn't make her contributions, so we held on to her arms. My legs? She asked, when the next month she still couldn't pay. She sat armless, collapsed boba sleeves at her sides in the middle of the circle, her head bowed so that her braids hid her face from our questioning eyes. We had never seen such ineptitude before, such resignation to humiliation. But her legs were sturdy, with firm calves that could kick a football with our sons, and strong knees that braced our daughters' heads when we plaited their hair, and laps that received our heads when we wept because the sky was still the wrong shade of blue, and our eyeballs felt heavy in our heads. My torso, she offered. My head, she contributed. Her voice got airier with each new part given. And what use were these breasts, this stomach, this heavy head filled with skull? But we took and we took and we took. It wasn't until we had all her body parts that we saw what she had done. Had we too not always wanted to shed our parts, be lighter, be nothing, be free? Would we also not give anything to have our bodies no longer belong to us? Now we do not speak about it because we're too ashamed to acknowledge how she deceived us into carrying her, bearing her weight forever, her sinew and bones and teeth and muscle and breath and blood. We avoid each other's eyes as we discuss contributions and collections. When we shuffle out of meetings, our shoulders hunch, our treads drag from the burden of her, from carrying what we have taken. That's it.
Wow, Pemi. I love this story so much.
Thanks.
It's short and it packs such a heavy punch. And one of the things, I mean, it just keeps building and building, right? You start learning about the structure of this co-op
Mhm.
bank that these women are doing, and then it just builds into a woman disembodying herself, kind of,
Yep.
Um, you don't expect that from the beginning.
Mhm.
And one of the things I think we talk about is familiarization.
Mhm.
And another way I look at it is like the uncanny, that
Mhm.
state of being in the unfamiliar.
Mhm.
Um, why are you interested in that space? Why do you think that enters into your writing?
Yeah. Um, so I think about defamiliarization on like two levels, right? There's like the level of like language, which is where like in terms of description or metaphor or maybe juxtaposing something with another thing, you muddy the perception of it. So the thing becomes strange, like describing a chair so that it doesn't look like a chair anymore or read like a chair. It becomes this like other like strange thing. I love that on like the language level. The way we focus on a word so much that it doesn't feel like a real word. That happens to me so much.
Right.
Um, but I love it also in terms of story, like when we zoom out in the sense of, so for example, in the story I just read,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a cooperative, but now that I've written a story where this woman is contributing her body parts, it's suddenly about something else. It's like taking something that people find familiar and then like twisting it so that something else can be seen. I think
Right.
about, I wrote a short story in 2015 called
Mm-hmm.
Caterer Caterer, and it was about this caterer who goes to a church, and shenanigans happen. But after writing that story, like over the years, so many people have like texted me or written to me, or when they met me, they said, "Oh, after reading that story, I didn't think about church food the same way." Right?
Right.
So now I'm thinking like if that short story makes people think about church food in a different way, if this short story contributions make people think about like women groups a different way, like
Right.
how can I like what's next can I make people see? Like how else can I change their perception? Like how can the bar keep going? Like can we then make people look at mundane or normal things in such a drastic different way that has like repercussions in like society and the way we move about, like how far can we go? Yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking about.
Right. And it's taking the idea of contributing and like setting, like in this story in particular, like setting strict rules to
Hmm.
the point that a woman gives all of herself. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, there's like this extra twist at the end where she's almost like the one who's who who got the most benefit out of
Mm-hmm.
everything,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting. So there's so many layers in the work that you do and in that space that you play in, because once you start breaking these, as you call them, like common or familiar spaces, you start to
Mm-hmm.
discover different things and different questions arise, right?
Yeah.
I don't think your work in general gives any answers or easy answers. It's more about questioning all of these things, and that's
Yeah.
really what makes it so wonderful.
Mm.
And I'm also interested. So, for example, in this story, there's this part where they take the woman's mother,
Mm-hmm.
and she becomes a lizard, a cat. Uh, and so in that jump, it starts to also, like, I mean, there are other parts where they were like, well, we took her daughter and then she cleaned for us and like she carried our groceries. And so that starts to make us a little bit uncomfortable in a way, because
Mm-hmm.
we're like, oh well, these women are really passionate this, or
They
like
are.
really strict about this. But then when the woman's mother becomes a cat, then we're in another space, and you start bringing us into like another space, and that's such a clever thing to do, because then she's gonna start giving her own body parts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that also makes me think of the idea of bodies and women's
Mm-hmm.
bodies, and how
Yeah.
in so like the mother is changing into these animals, and
Yeah.
then she herself is giving away her own body, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and I think in a lot of your stories and your work, women's bodies play a really important role.
Yeah.
There is a lot of physical things that happen, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, what you like, or why
About
you're interested in that.
yeah. I mean, I think it comes from being a woman in this particular world.
Right.
Um, Especially like a Nigerian woman. I think a lot of it like it's not news that women's bodies are policed, right? I think like growing up, it was always something or the other. Like don't dress up to not attract attention, but also you should dress to attract attention.
Mhm.
And you are scolded if you have like too many scars from playing like a boy, or my mother would complain if I wore like baggy t-shirts for men because she's like, "What are you doing?" So there's a way like that moving through the world just makes you like viscerally aware of like your body, like your corporeal form, right? And
Right.
it also goes on to, especially in spaces like Nigeria, where there's like domesticity, right? It's like we like in
Mhm.
this story too, like women cleaning and birthing children and working. There's a way like our bodies are always constantly on the line, right? Our bodies never exist just in isolation.
Mhm.
Um, so even the ways that sometimes women's bodies are thought of as sacred, right? Like
Right.
there's like the whole purity culture and all of that.
Right.
So just because naturally, because I have lived in this body and I've had all these experiences, I obviously tend towards writing that. But also, like in the story I read, I was thinking, so what if a woman like decided to just like opt out of all of that?
Yeah.
And it isn't something that I guess we really understand until the end of the story, but
Yeah.
there's a way that it can just be so tiring. And you were talking about speculative fiction, all the layers that can be read in it. I remember this Laura Vandenberg quote about how when there's a supernatural, it's no longer about what it is, but why it is.
Right.
Um, and so, um, and yeah, there's something about like transformation. I love transformation stories. Like you
Mhm.
spoke about that.
Yeah.
Um, and then when I think about like transformation and I think about like the Nigerian woman's body, like a story like this is for an example of something that comes out of the meeting of these thoughts.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And also, when there are other stories in which women's bodies, like in Manifest, where like there's the grandmother, right,
Mm-hmm.
who's embodying the protagonist,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a certain harshness that converts into kind of cruelty in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also in your work there are those moments that kind of jolt us into existing in those defamiliarized spaces or uncanny
It's a hard
spaces.
one.
I know. and and also with this bodily, which some can call body horror,
Mm-hmm.
it there's also that jolt of like bringing us into a different space, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think it all combines into, um as I see it, it's more that you want to talk about these issues or write about these issues or explore these issues, and the
Mm-hmm.
way to do it that makes sense is speculative, but not the other way around. I don't know if that makes sense. Like you're
Yeah.
not writing like speculative for the sake of speculative. It's
Mm-hmm.
speculative because that's the way that the story needs to be built.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good observation. Karen Russell talks about it like um about how speculative fiction, no matter how like extreme it is about coming to like an extreme emotional realism,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
About distorting the truth to find distortion to find the truth rather than the truth being distortion. Like I think that's Daniel O'Connor. So
hmm,
yeah, so like the point of it isn't necessarily the strangeness or the magic. It's like what else is lying like underneath that. And obviously I grew up in a space where there are just so many stories, so many
right,
superstitions, like don't pick this from the ground, you turn into a yam. It like inspiration for a huge chunk of my stories when I was young, I came from the newspaper because there were all these wild stories. Oh, a woman in this city gave birth to a yam. Or this man lost his manhood while he was walking in the market. And so like growing up with like these wild
yeah,
stories around obviously just like seeps in. But then I was like, what if this strangeness because what if I took it seriously and saw what
exactly,
else was underneath that, like
right,
take this as your baseline for truth and then see what else happens, like what after that, what next, what else emerges after
right.
all the strangeness.
Right. And
Yeah.
there is a truth in those, I mean, in those stories
Mm-hmm.
that happen in our cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in Mexico we don't talk about yams so much, but like but there are definitely like it's not strange to be like talking about how your grandma visited you last night, you know,
Yes.
even though she's dead, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, like those stories like come up in regular conversation and nobody's like, oh my god, maybe you're going insane, or or you know, like
Mm-hmm.
there is no there is a like a semi consensus that that is kind of what is happening.
Yes, it's also
um
real. Yes.
yeah, exactly. And so I feel that it's a coping mechanism, but also there's a way that we do actually see the world that way, that
Mm-hmm.
because we believe or we see those spirits or those uncanny things or
Mm-hmm.
fantastical things, they do exist for us because we do
Mm-hmm.
talk about it and we accept it as part of our reality.
Yeah.
um
Julio Cortázar says that reality is multiple and infinite. And so just
right,
like the space for that. But speaking of like these stories that we hear, I know there's a big one that not a big one, but it's very important in your novel. Like it's like there's a story that Magos, the mother character, hears that kind of incites most of the plot really. And
right.
so if you could read a little bit for us before we like continue the conversation.
Yeah, so I'll read
Okay.
a little bit and then we can continue.
Okay.
Okay. So this is from my novel Monstrilio. This is it. Um, and I'm gonna read a part. So the book is about a mother who, well, a family actually, who loses their son, and the mother takes a piece of her of her son's lung for her to keep, and then she feeds the lung, and um, and the lung grows into a little monster, and the monster then grows into a young man. And I'm gonna read. So the book is divided into four parts, each told by a different character. And I'm gonna read from the last part, which is told by the monster himself, which at this point he's called M. And so I'm just gonna read a little bit from that part, and we can continue our conversation. A passport is a booklet with your name and picture on it. Mine says Santiago Jansen de la Mora. Capitalized letters. It doesn't say human because only humans get a passport. Mine comforts me like an alibi. It's like a trick. That way I unhinge my jaw and stretch my lips all the way to my earlobes. My head split halfway through. But it's not a trick. I'm not trying to fool anyone. It feels good, letting my fangs air out. I do this when I'm alone, preferably outside. At night, people would freak out if they saw, except Uncle Luke. He gave me a thumbs up when he saw. Purpose of visit? The passport control man asks. I live here now. He flips through my passport, looks at his computer. What were you doing in Germany? I lived there before. The man types fast. He could be writing, access denied, not human. I stand taller, smile, lips closed. Easy. I can be very human, though for a while I refused to. I wouldn't even go out. The world was scary. Worse, I was carrying it. In a body I had no clue how to handle. More parts than I knew what to do with. But I had Santiago's memories, his frailty and unwieldy kindness. All set, the man says. He returns my passport, waves the next person forward. I'm hungry. Uncle Luke waits for us in arrivals, pulls me into a hug, pats my cheek, grunts to ask how I'm doing. I'm fine, Uncle Luke says. We walk into the living room, where I usually read the books Luke gives me. We leave the suitcases in the foyer. Mine is a small bag, the one Papi packed for me in Berlin. It's enough. Clothes are too much work anyway, and I like my outfit. I wear the same one almost every day. We sit. I don't have a book. Doesn't seem like a moment to read anyway. Uncle Luke grunts. Give us a minute, Pappy says. He collapses on the couch. We just got here. I ate our neighbor, I say. Bit him. I swallowed parts. He's still alive. He may die. We want him to live, of course, Pappy says. What you did was a mistake, a bad moment. Uncle Luke picks up one of his yellow pads. I read aloud. No mistake, this is M. Papi says, I know this is M. Telling me I'm M doesn't afford the clarity they think it does. Papi is napping. A mistake is something you wish you hadn't done. I ask Uncle Luke if this is true. He shrugs. I say that I don't like that Elias is hurt, but that I don't wish I hadn't done it. I still keep tasting him. Very delicious. Uncle Luke runs but not an answer. He hands me a note. Beef tartare just for you. We go to the kitchen. Uncle Luke doesn't mind how enthusiastically I eat. He drinks red wine, pats my hand. I lick my plate. More, Uncle Luke writes. I'm still hungry, but I say I'm fine. I take our dirty plates to the sink. A sliver of pink sunset light shines on the wall in front of me. So pretty a dread grows right in my chest. Monstrilio loved this light the best. Night is when we're hungriest, and hunger can be magnificent. I stare at the half-washed dishes. I fight to push the dread out. I pretend my time as Monstrilio is hazy, muffled sounds and blurred colors. I say I remember warmth, but I don't say I miss my fur. I don't say I'm hungry because my hunger is what makes everyone scared. They are happy to believe I forgot how they maimed me. And that's it. Yay.
Excellent. I always laugh so much when you read like delicious.
Uh,
So I think that there's a way that moving through the world where the majority is a when you're not part of the dominant majority, right, that kind of lends itself to surrealism,
Yeah.
right? There's a
Yeah.
way that as a Nigerian woman moving through the world, sometimes my reality feels askew. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the same thing can be said for like queerness, right? And
Yes.
I think that when we think about like monsters and monstrosities, there's a way that a lot of times people are writing about like otherness, right?
Yeah.
Like being on the outside of things. But then
Yeah.
you've written this book about this monster who is just like very much loved
Yes.
by those around him. So I was wondering about if that was like a deliberate like twist on the head, or what you were thinking about in terms of like being an other, being outside the dominant majority versus being surrounded and loved still in that same context.
Right. So I guess I was thinking, so it was a deliberate choice to have the monster be loved from the beginning because I wanted to
Mm,
kind of test how much love can endure.
mm,
But also now, when I was hearing you phrase the question just like that, it also when this family loves this monster, even though they know it, he's a monster, and he starts eating people, and they still kind of like care for him. um, it kind of like makes the whole family other, right? Like as a
mm,
unit. And so they're kind of like put into this place to live in his shoes a little bit, even though they don't fully understand what is happening.
mhm,
um he doesn't even like understand it fully either, but the whole family as a unit is put into that other space, right? So they move now as a whole unit as an other.
mhm,
And so that kind of is what um and their love then kind of becomes like that shield that keeps them together,
mhm,
even though there are like things that might or might not break them apart. But so yeah, so when I thought about like a monster, I obviously wanted him, well, I don't know if it's obvious, but I wanted him to be a monster, like a real
mhm,
monster, just because otherwise it's just like a nice furry little creature.
mhm.
Or but I wanted him to do things that we would consider monstrous.
Yeah, real
Um,
consequences.
so and that was important because that was kind of like what would test this unity, right?
Mhm,
And I think also like in your stories, you also kind of like push the limits on what we consider like a a good person would do, or like and I think that also brings a lot of emotion, but a lot of questions into the
mhm.
work, right?
Yeah.
It kind of jolts the reader or into thinking like, oh, okay, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this, but I'm gonna think about it, and I think
Yes.
that's important.
Yeah. I love sneaky stories like that. Those are my favorite kind of stories to read and to
Yeah.
write, where you enter it thinking you're reading something in particular, and then slowly, like your expectations are just like warped. You're like, oh no, I am not where I thought I was like 5 minutes ago. So I love that. I was thinking about when you brought up manifest, and I was thinking
Yes,
about that
I
in
love that story.
terms of like bodies again. But also I remember like part of what I think attracts me to bodies is um also in terms of like who came before us and what we look like, which is
Yeah.
something I was thinking about in that particular story. Is like you think you're your own person,
Mm-hmm.
but even just without anybody knowing me, they will see
Mm-hmm.
me right next to my mother and know that I came from her. And so
Yeah.
it's like, where where does that I think Joanne spoke about like me thinking about like the individual versus community, and just like
Mm-hmm.
the tension between those two things, and
Yeah.
how that kind of tension is literally externalized like in the body, right?
Right.
Um,
And you have breast milk too, which
that
is
is
like the
true.
other side of that, because it's a mother with her
Hmm.
child,
Hmm.
and it's the breast milk that won't come,
Yeah.
and so it's like a physical reaction to that. departing of being that individual, and there's other things going on,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also that like what part of me is my body and what part, like how do I
Yeah.
differentiate myself, right?
Yeah, that's real. When you think about when you write bodies, because so,
Hmm.
and a lot of people put me in like the horror space,
Hmm.
even though I don't. I sometimes I'm like, really? That wasn't really the the plan. Like so, for example, the story I read, even though some it's horrific, the
Hmm.
premise is sometimes horrific, but I don't necessarily think of it as horror. I think it's more absurd than anything. It's like I'm like
Mm,
thinking, how can I like radically take this story to the most extreme, right? And then
right.
that's why it becomes horrific. But you actually write like horrific things happen in your novel, and I'm curious about like when you sit down to write such a like those kind of visceral parts, like how does your own body fit into that own process, like what is your own visceral experience of writing such visceral such visceral scenes on page.
I just, I'm like you, I'm interested in bodies, maybe in different
Mm-hmm.
ways. I'm interested in the frailty of bodies. I was born with like a bone disease, so like I broke my bones really easily when I was younger. Now they're fine, they're better,
Mm-hmm.
but my teeth still break. So I'm always thinking of bodies just because I had to think of my body at such an early age and like my relationship to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so um when you feel something or when you have like an experience, I feel like if when you feel it in your body, it just becomes more real for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted that to be in the work I do and to embody those things.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, horror, like sometimes I just want everybody in my stories to be happy. And then like horror, like bad things happening, it's just like a way to push myself to like have
Mm-hmm.
to like actually explore what I need to explore and not just like
Mm-hmm.
live in this boring happy place.
Yeah.
And so that's what like horror or like pushing those boundaries help. And also and I think why we say horror to a lot of things is because we're so afraid of our bodies that anything that we see happening to a body or anybody that is different
Yes.
or transforms, we just automatically say horror, right? Just because
Yeah.
we're so afraid, and we have
That's.
such complicated relationships to our own
Mm-hmm.
bodies that anytime we see like something happen to a body or like or just portray a body that is different, we almost always say horror, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the tradition of like having freaks in like
Mm-hmm.
circuses and all of that, you know. It's
Mm-hmm.
all this like it's both spectacle and it's both a reflection on yourself of how afraid you are of something
Yeah.
not being normal or
Yeah.
whatever, you know.
That's a really good point. Um, Carmen Maria Machado in her Paris Review interview, that I think was the Art of Fiction,
Mm-hmm.
spoke about how, like with horror, like the reader enters their own minds, their own fears, and their own anxieties. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Like what you're saying about how when a body, because it's no longer about that body, it's about your body. Like when you're
Mm-hmm.
looking at something that makes you uncomfortable, then that's where the horror comes from. It's like from you, not
Yeah.
necessarily. It's very, yeah, it's very intimate. That's a really good
Yeah,
point.
I don't know if this happens to you, but like if you see like or read or a scene where like they're cutting off a finger, you cannot like grab your finger and you're like no,
Mhm.
or like something like that, because we just connect so viscerally to those
Mhm.
things that you can almost feel the pain.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's a great point. Let's see. I was going to ask you, since we both have write short stories and then like the novel, and we both written novels, so somehow, for you, just like
We
how
have
we it was hard, but we did it. Um,
somehow.
for you, how different was that process? Especially, I think, since we're talking about bodies and horror and the surreal and the strange. So like in the short story form versus the novel form, how was there a different approach? Was there a different mindset between these two things?
I think there is, and I think it's interesting because we have different processes, even like
Mm-hmm.
between you and I. But like,
Mm-hmm.
um, but for like a short story, in the sense of like, so there are many things that are different, but one of the things in like, for example, world building, I guess you could say, because in speculative you kind of like create like this different or uncanny thing, and either you explain it or you don't,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so in short stories, obviously there's less space to do that. So in my case, it kind of pushes me to just not explain almost anything at all. Which I mean, that's what I love about your work too, because you don't explain the uncanny; it just lives there. You know, it's
So
yeah, and I love it because then that just adds like, in a way, like brings the reader closer to you or to your stories, just because you have to kind of like bridge that gap and like put yourself in it and kind of like understand where you belong in that space, even if you're confused. And I
mm-hmm.
really like that, and I think that's something that I've learned. I think at the beginning when I wrote those type of short stories, I kind of had like this instinct that I had to explain why the weirdness was happening
Mm-hmm.
without just letting it happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I let it happen. And in the novel, there's also, just because you have, or in theory, you have like more bandwidth to explain things, you have also this like temptation to explain more or to, and there is
Yeah.
like, there are, I mean, if you read a fantasy novel, you can just spend pages and pages of just world building.
Exposition. Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess it depends on what you want to do and how you want the world to be created. For example, in Monstrilio, the book, the monster is something different. It's not part of like the common world,
Mm-hmm.
but he's not too different that they're like, well, we're just, like everything's, the reality has shifted or something. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like in an in between space where they believe he can exist, even though he's
Mm-hmm.
an anomaly.
Yeah.
Um,
That that reminds me of Leslie Nekarima talks. She talks about she has her understanding of like speculative fiction is like divided into three. There's like
mhm,
our world but different. There's our world much changed, and then there's like a brand new world. And
right.
I think you and I tend to be in the first part where
Yes,
it's like
exactly.
quite close to realism, where
Yeah.
there's just like one thing off, but it's still most of the world is recognizable. But
Hmm.
yeah, similar to you, I think writing short stories, it's easier for me to like live in the mystery
Right.
of things where I you drop the reader into it, and then it's a moment, right? It's a moment you're sharing with the reader, and then like time
Yeah.
15 pages done, then you can leave. And like all the questions. It's more for me, a lot of stories are more about experience more
Hmm.
than
Hmm.
I don't necessarily live here. Sometimes I do, but a lot of times I'm happy to leave a story with an impression, with an experience, necessarily more than, oh, this is why this happened and that happened. But
Right. Right.
with a novel, it's so hard. It's so hard.
It
One of
is.
one of the notes I got from my editor was literally about this, where she referenced my own short story and said,
Hmm.
"Look, with this story, you didn't try to explain. So
Uh-huh.
why are you then like, if this is the mode that you already operate in, why do you feel like you have to
Right.
have an explanation for all the strangeness in the
Right.
novel?" Which just I was like, damn.
But it's true. I think also there's like an expectation of what a
Hmm.
novel should be, or maybe, or
Yes.
maybe we just feel that the short story can accommodate more experimentation for
That's
some
yes.
reason.
Hmm.
But we have like an expectation of what a novel could be as
Hmm.
readers and writers, and
Yes.
so we feel like we must explain or like be less experimental or less,
Hmm.
so it is hard. Even like explaining, not even like speculative things, I found it hard sometimes. It's like well, how are they suddenly in another place? Or
Yes.
and there's a balance you have to like you work through. I don't know if I have like a formula or an answer to it, but like you work through what like the reader will uh know. They'll make the jump with you,
Hmm.
and when you leave readers behind.
Yes.
And yeah, and also it's just like a decision, I guess, one has to make as a writer, as an artist, to decide, well, I do want them to make the leap with me, and if I leave
Hmm.
some behind, then they're
That's okay.
behind.
Yeah, that's okay. We all have our readers. We all have we all have our writers.
Yeah.
Okay. We have 10 minutes left. My last question was going to be about, I mean, like a similarity that you and I have is our backgrounds in like um I don't want to say art because I'm like having this
Like
conversation in my head like,
visual.
is architecture art? Is like
Well, it
yes, it
is.
is. Yes, but both of us basically have come from very different. Well, not very. Is it different? Maybe that's the question. Like, where do you see
It's
where the
adjacent,
adjacent,
but
right?
like more
So,
commercial, or I don't know how
mm,
to say, or like more business oriented, because you did like
yes,
architecture
yes,
to actually like build
to
something
build.
functional and
Hmm.
get paid.
I mean, we.
It's like a more of like, I don't know, like everything's a job. I don't know, but like I don't know how to explain it. But like, yeah,
Mhm.
I worked in visual art, but also like in advertising, which is like a
Yes,
more like commercial way to like do that design and
art.
stuff.
Yeah. So, do you find it bleeding in, or do you think that it's a different like face of the same thing? Like, where does your history in like design, in film, in advertising, like,
Right.
do you find it bleeds into writing, like the novels and the stories?
I think the part in visual art, when I was like more like into film or
Mm-hmm.
photography, like that was more related to like an artistic vision or like an artistic practice,
Mm-hmm.
that definitely like bleeds into it, just in ways of thinking about things, or like how do you talk about a photograph, it's like
Mm-hmm.
how I sometimes think about a scene is like, so when I was learning photography, like they teach you to look at the edges, because the
Mm-hmm.
whole picture is your frame, not just like the middle part. And so to look at the edges of stories and what is there, what is lurking behind there, that can be really interesting, and it also is part of the composition.
Mm-hmm.
So those things do like bleed into, and of course film, like just like narrative and storytelling, all those things
Mm-hmm.
obviously bleed. I think with advertising is a little bit more removed, also because I was doing more like digital stuff. um,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, it's definitely an experience, like a life experience. I think like all life experiences like kind of like
Yes.
bleed into.
Bleeding. Yeah,
Yeah. How do you
that's
feel
right.
about architecture?
That's not the right question for this.
No, no,
For
like how
you
it
mean
relates
I
to your
think I
writing.
mean yes, you have to add that part because that's a different question.
Yeah.
But my canned answer used to be that it was about that everything was about building. Like you create a foundation and you build, and much like a building, a story or a novel is about like all these different parts, and if they can hold the structure, right? If
Hmm.
how they are interconnected. And in theory, this is also true. But also I
Hmm.
think it's one of those answers, right, that people like to hear. Like, architecture is similar to writing. We're all building. These days I'm not so sure.
Hmm.
All I know is that like similar to you, there's a way that like framing scenes, like staging, all of that. I'm tapping into that visual
Hmm.
part of my brain. But at the end of the day, it's just about, I think, concerns.
Hmm.
Um, I still write about houses. I still write about like the city. So those are some concerns that have filtered in from my life my life working as an architect. Just life accumulation of experiences. So I think it's all storytelling somehow. Um,
Yeah.
And
Or
so
that's what people say. I don't
that's that, yeah.
know. No, but like, I mean, I think people love because we all love stories, and like
Mm-hmm.
stories are a really way to kind of like be human almost.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a very intricate part of like community and humanity, and
Yes.
so we do try to like make everything tell a story, or like that's how maybe we relate to the world.
Yeah.
um
Makes sense.
so
Makes
yeah.
sense. Okay. I think that we should end it here. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to me. I could
Thank
talk
you
to
for
you
inviting me,
forever.
Pemi.
Yay.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you quickly to just like James Merrill House for having me here. This is such a beautiful space. I just feel really excited and honored that I can work here. It's just so delightful to be able to pick up so many books off the shelves. And I'm grateful for this legacy and for the people who preserve it, because I think the reason why I'm enjoying this is all the people behind the scenes who have preserved this space. So thank you to everybody at James Merrill House. Thank you, Joanne, again for introducing us. And thanks everybody for coming or watching whenever you do.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, friend.
Bye.
So, hi. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Bergen. It is lovely to see the James Merrill hidden study of 107 behind you. It's very nostalgic.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So this is my new book. It's called The Math Campers.
My own novel. It's called These Women.
It looks like this.
Well, the first thing I'll say is all the dreams are actual dreams. There's nothing worse than a fabricated dream. You can always tell.
I normally don't write in first person because of the fact that as soon as you have a narrator, you tend to have somebody listening, or there's an implied audience.
I just got to soak up in the atmosphere in that house. You just feel like a writer, and you feel like you're part of this tradition and a community, and it feels like the work is important.
Magical things happen when you're looking at Merrill's books.
Well, it was a really, really transformative residency for me. It might sound like a bit of an overstatement, but it really wasn't.
Merrill's really distinct imagination was present in every detail.
Thanks, Brendan. Bye. Enjoy Stonington on my behalf.